There is a Bible in most Christian homes that has a crease running through the middle of it. Not a physical crease, but a kind of invisible line where the pages on one side are worn and soft from years of reading, and the pages on the other side are stiff, barely opened. The New Testament is the read half, and the Old Testament is the half that mostly waits. If that is your Bible, you are not alone, and this video is for you. But before we go any further, I want to say something that most Bible teachers do not say out loud. If you have been a Christian for 20, 30, 40 years, and the Old Testament has always felt distant or confusing, or like something you keep meaning to get to that is not a failure of faith, it is not a sign that something is wrong with you. The Old Testament is genuinely difficult. It is long and strange and full of things that resist easy reading, laws that seem irrelevant, genealogies that seem endless, violence that seems at odds with everything you thought you knew about God. And so, quietly, without anyone making a formal decision, most Christians have found a way around it. Read the Gospels. Read Paul. Come back to the Old Testament someday. Someday usually does not come. And underneath that, for many people, is a quiet unease, a sense that you are standing in a room and everyone else knows something you do not, that your faith is built on a foundation you have never actually looked at, that the book you hold is deeper than you have gone. This video is not here to make you feel guilty about that. It is here to show you what is waiting on the other side of that feeling, and why, once you see it, the New Testament will never look the same. Because here is the thing nobody says plainly enough. The New Testament was written by people who had the Old Testament memorized, every single author, formed by the Hebrew Scriptures from childhood. When they wrote about Jesus, about the cross, about grace, about atonement, about the resurrection, they were not inventing a new religion. They were recognizing the end of a very long story, a story that had been building for centuries before the first word of the New Testament was ever written. And if you have not read the beginning of that story, not just the familiar passages, but the actual weight of it, then you are reading their words while missing most of what they assumed you already knew. Before this video ends, you will understand why. On the day Jesus was dying, he was reading, not crying out in wordless agony, reading. And when you understand what he was reading, and why the cross will never look quite the same, but we have to start with the problem. The simple, quiet problem of reading only half a letter. Imagine you receive a letter, not an email, a letter, handwritten, from someone who loved you, but only the second half arrived, the page that begins mid-sentence. You can read it. The words make sense in isolation, but there are references you do not understand, promises that seem to come from nowhere, and a weight in certain sentences that you cannot account for because you never read what came before. That is what it is like to read the New Testament without the Old. The writers of the New Testament were not writing for people who had no context. They were writing for people, Jewish Christians, Gentile converts who had studied in synagogues who already knew the Hebrew Scriptures. When Paul writes that Christ our Passover Lamb has been sacrificed, he is not explaining the Passover. He expects you to already know it. He expects you to feel the full weight of Exodus 12, the lamb selected 4 days early, the blood painted on the doorframe with a branch of hyssop, the firstborn sons, the night that ended 400 years of slavery before the phrase Passover Lamb means anything more than a title. If you do not know Exodus, the phrase is thin, a name. If you know Exodus, the phrase breaks open. You can see a family crouched in the lamplight, brushing blood onto wood in the middle of the night. You can hear a child asking why they are eating with their sandals on, their cloak tucked in, their staff in their hand ready to move at a moment's notice. You can feel what it cost and what it meant when that doorframe held while every unprotected house around them did not. And then Paul's sentence is not just theology, it is recognition. The same God, the same blood, the same deliverance, just now accomplished not in one night in Egypt, but in one afternoon outside Jerusalem. That is what you lose when you skip the Old Testament. Not just background information, the weight itself. And it is not only the Passover. In the letter to the Hebrews, the writer explains that Jesus is the high priest who entered not a tent built by human hands, but the true sanctuary, the one the earthly tabernacle was always a shadow of. If you have never read Exodus and Leviticus, if you have never sat with the careful, almost obsessive detail of the tabernacle instructions, the curtain, the ark, the mercy seat, the specific garments, the blood, then the argument in Hebrews floats loose. It becomes abstract. Beautiful, perhaps, but ungrounded. The writer of Hebrews is not making a philosophical point. He is saying, that thing your fathers did every year, that ritual, that blood, that curtain, this is what it was always pointing toward. Look, now you can see it. You can only feel that if you knew what the thing was. Think about the word atonement. Most Christians know it as a New Testament idea. Christ atones for sin. But the mechanism behind it, the logic of why blood matters, why a substitute matters, why death stands in the gap between guilt and forgiveness, that is built entirely from Leviticus. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest, once a year, entering the most holy place with blood not his own. The scapegoat driven into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the whole nation on its back, disappearing into the desert so that the people could stand clean before God. If you have never read those chapters, atonement is a transaction you are asked to accept without ever seeing the ledger. The New Testament tells you the debt is paid. The Old Testament shows you how the accounting worked and what it cost. This is not optional background. It is the foundation. The cross itself is surrounded by the Old Testament on all sides. When Jesus is hanging on the cross, in the last hours of his life, he speaks the words that have become his most quoted statement from that day. My God, why have you forsaken me? Most people hear those words as a cry of abandonment, the raw grief of a man who feels God has left him at the worst possible moment. And that hearing is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because those words are not words he invented in agony. He is reciting the opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm that every person standing at that hill would have known by memory. A psalm that, if you follow it past the first line, if you stay with it past the moment of despair, does not end in abandonment. It ends in vindication. It ends with the declaration that God has not despised the suffering of the afflicted, that he has not hidden his face from him, that when he cried, God heard. What looks like the cry of a man forsaken is, for those who have read the psalm, the opening line of a prayer that already knows it will be answered. But you can only hear that if you have read the psalm. Stay with that, because this is what the New Testament does constantly. It speaks in a language built from the Old. Its writers are not being obscure. They are trusting their readers to know the library they are drawing from. And then there is Isaiah. The book of Isaiah was written approximately 700 years before the birth of Jesus, 7 centuries. The prophet was writing to a nation under threat, a people afraid of what Assyria and Babylon would bring, a community that had largely forgotten the God who had carried them through the wilderness. He was writing about his present moment, but in the middle of that book, there is a passage that has stopped readers in their tracks since the moment it was written. The 53rd chapter describes a figure, not a king, not a warrior, not a political deliverer, a servant, someone despised and rejected by people, someone described with the Hebrew word makab, pain that goes deep, the kind of grief that changes the shape of a person's face. He is stricken, crushed, wounded for the transgressions of others. He is silent before his accusers. He is given a burial with the wealthy, though he has done no violence and spoken no deceit. He bears the sin of many and makes intercession for those who wronged him. For 7 centuries, Jewish scholars debated who this servant was. Some said it was Israel as a nation, suffering on behalf of the world. Some said it was a righteous figure from the past. The scrolls offered no resolution. The debate continued. Then, a morning arrived outside Jerusalem. A man was publicly executed after a false trial. He was silent before his accusers. He was buried in a borrowed tomb belonging to a wealthy man, And when his followers began to describe what had happened when they gathered in the days after, still trembling, still confused, they reached instinctively for the scroll of Isaiah, not because someone told them to, because the words already fit in a way that no one had anticipated they would. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the caves near Qumran, confirmed that the text of Isaiah we read today was being copied and carefully preserved centuries before the birth of Jesus, essentially identical to what we hold now. This was not retrofitted. The portrait was painted first, the face came later, and Isaiah is not alone. Micah, writing in the same century as Isaiah, named Bethlehem, a small, overlooked village, as the birthplace of the one who would shepherd Israel. Zechariah, writing 5 centuries before Palm Sunday, described a king coming to Jerusalem on a donkey, not a war horse, not in the posture of military triumph, but in the posture of peace and poverty. The Psalms scatter what reads now, like forensic details of the crucifixion, across dozens of chapters, pierced hands and feet, onlookers casting lots for clothing, a man crying out in thirst and receiving vinegar, written in a culture where crucifixion was not yet a Roman practice in Judea. The cumulative weight of this is not coincidence. It is architecture. A very long, very patient structure, built across centuries by writers who did not fully understand what they were building, only that they were told to build it faithfully. Here is one more detail. In the 8th chapter of Acts, there is a man traveling from Jerusalem to Ethiopia on a desert road. He is wealthy. He is educated. He is a senior official in the court of the Ethiopian queen, and he is reading Isaiah in his chariot, completely unable to understand what he is reading. He comes to the 53rd chapter, the suffering servant, led like a sheep to slaughter, and he asks the disciple Philip the same question that had puzzled interpreters for centuries. Is the prophet talking about himself or about someone else? Philip sits down beside him in the chariot, and beginning from that passage, he explains who Jesus is. That same conversation has been happening ever since. In living rooms and prison cells and hospital waiting rooms, someone opens Isaiah. The question comes, and, for those with ears to hear, the face slowly comes into focus. The Greek word that Jesus uses in Matthew when he speaks about the Old Testament plero does not mean cancel. It does not mean replace. It means to bring to fullness, to fill up the meaning that was always there but not yet visible. He was not standing against the Hebrew Scriptures. He was standing in the space they had shaped, a space that had been measuring, silently, for 7 centuries. If this kind of Bible study, staying inside the text long enough for it to open, is what you have been looking for, subscribe. There is more like this coming every week. But before we go any further, we need to stop and face something, because there is a question that has been sitting in the room since the beginning of this video, and most Bible teachers walk past it without stopping. I am not going to do that. The question is this: if the Old Testament and the New Testament are the same story, if it is all one God, one movement, one faithfulness, then how do you explain the God who orders the slaughter of the Canaanites? The God who instructs the complete destruction of a city, men and women and children and animals, leaving nothing alive? The God who seems, at times, to be a very different being from the one Jesus calls Father, the one who says, "Blessed are the merciful," who tells his disciples to love their enemies, who stops the execution of a woman caught in adultery. This is not a question only skeptics ask. It is a question that many sincere Christians carry quietly, sometimes for decades, and it deserves more than a deflection. So here is what I can offer, not a clean resolution, because there is not one, but an honest account of what is actually there. The first thing to notice is that the violence in the Old Testament is not uniformly celebrated. The text itself contains voices that push back against it. The prophets challenge kings. The Psalms cry out against injustice. Job argues with God directly, and God, at the end of the book, says Job has spoken rightly. The Old Testament is not a monologue. It is a long, honest, sometimes agonizing conversation between a people and their God, and the conversation does not always end tidily. The second thing to notice is that the people writing the Old Testament were not confused about what they were doing or who they were. They were a small people, surrounded by nations that practiced child sacrifice, that treated human life as disposable, that worshipped power without restraint. The moral vision emerging from the Hebrew Scriptures, that the poor deserve protection, that the foreigner must be welcomed, that even kings are accountable to God, was not the common view of the ancient world. It was radical, it was costly, and it was arriving in history slowly, the way all deep change arrives, incrementally and imperfectly, through people who were themselves imperfect. The third thing, and this is the one that I think matters most, is that Jesus himself did not solve this problem by discarding the Old Testament. He solved it by going deeper into it. He quoted the prophets against the religious establishment. He cited the law against those who use the law to oppress. He said that the whole of Scripture could be summarized in 2 commands: love God, love your neighbor, and then he spent his ministry showing what that looked like when you refuse to make exceptions. He did not tell his followers to stop reading the difficult parts. He told them to read more carefully, to notice what the text was actually saying beneath the surface of what they thought it was saying. There is a verse in the book of Micah, one of the same prophets who named Bethlehem, that reads like this: "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" That verse is not from the New Testament. It is from the 8th century before Christ, and it does not sound like a God who is primarily interested in conquest and blood. What the Old Testament contains is not a simple picture, but neither is it a simple problem. It is the record of a God who entered history at a particular time, through a particular people, in a world that was far more brutal than ours, and who began, patiently and persistently, the long work of changing what human beings believed was possible. You do not have to resolve every tension in order to read the Old Testament honestly. You do have to bring the same willingness to sit with difficulty that you would bring to any relationship that matters, including the ones that have shaped you most. And Jesus himself knew all of this. On the day after the resurrection, before most of the disciples had seen him, while grief was still the dominant weather in Jerusalem, 2 people were walking to a village called Emmaus. They were talking about everything that had happened: the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the strange, impossible reports from the tomb that morning. And a stranger fell into step beside them. They did not recognize him. The stranger asked what they were discussing. They told him, sadly. With the exhaustion of people whose hope had arrived and then been taken, and the stranger began with Moses, then moved through the prophets, then walked them through all of the Hebrew Scriptures, explaining what was written there about the one who had to suffer these things and then enter his glory. They said afterward that their hearts burned inside them while he was talking, not just their minds, their hearts. Something in the old, familiar texts was suddenly alive in a way it had not been before. The same texts they had grown up hearing in the synagogue, the same scrolls their fathers had read aloud, and now they burned. This is what happens to people who return to the Old Testament after they have met Jesus. The text does not get smaller, it gets larger. Abraham and Isaac, on the mountain, the Father, the Son, the wood laid across the boy's back, and then the ram caught in the thorn bush at the last possible moment, reads differently once you have stood outside an empty tomb. The Passover reads differently once you have held the bread at the table and heard the words, "This is my body." The Psalms of Lament. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me?" read differently once you have knelt beside someone who is dying and found that you have no words left and nothing left to do but cry. You thought you knew those texts, and you did, but you did not know them the way they were meant to be known, from the inside of them, from the cost of them, from the place where the promises were tested under full weight and held. The disciples at Emmaus had read those texts their whole lives. They did not understand them until the one who fulfilled them sat down and walked them through. That is not an accident. That is the design. There is still one more thing the Old Testament gives you: that the New Testament cannot give alone. It gives you a God with a history, not an idea, not a principle, not a force that moves through the universe in ways that can be sensed but not seen. A being who has been doing something specifically, deliberately, at great cost for a very long time. A being with a record, and you can read that record. You can trace the pattern of how he moves. You can see him in Exodus, remembering the covenant he made with Abraham 4 centuries after the man died. The descendants of that covenant are slaves in Egypt. Some of them have been slaves so long that they have forgotten there was ever a promise. And then the text says, simply, God heard their groaning. God remembered. And everything begins to move. Let me give you one image from that movement. Picture a woman in Babylon. Not a name we know, just a woman, one of tens of thousands of Jewish exiles, living in a foreign city, raising children who have never seen Jerusalem. The temple is gone. The city is rubble. There are psalms from this period that describe sitting by the rivers of Babylon and weeping, hanging their harps on the willow trees because they cannot bring themselves to sing the songs of home in a strange land. And yet this woman, in the dark, sings those psalms to her children anyway. Not because she knows they will return, not because the promise feels close, but because the promise is all she has, and she will not let her children grow up without it. She does not live to see the return from exile, but her grandchildren do. That is the God of the Old Testament, not a God who keeps every promise on your timeline, but a God who does not abandon the thread. A God who, when everything looks like it has finally ended, is still doing something slowly, quietly, at a scale you cannot see from where you are standing. The God the New Testament calls your Father is not a stranger. He has a biography. And it is not a tidy biography, not a highlight reel, not a list of victories only. It is a record of faithfulness through failure, faithfulness through silence, faithfulness through centuries, when the promises looked like they had quietly expired. A man named Marcion tried to remove the Old Testament from Christianity in the 2nd century. He argued that the God of wrath in the Hebrew Bible was a different being from the God of grace that Jesus revealed. The early church rejected him not because they found the Old Testament easy, but because they understood clearly a God without a history is a God you cannot trust. Grace without roots is just a feeling. The cross without the Old Testament is a tragedy without a backstory moving, perhaps, but stripped of the weight that makes it more than a story about a man who died on a particular afternoon. Augustine, in the 4th century, spent his life reading both testaments together. His conclusion was this: the new is concealed in the old, and the old is revealed in the new. Not the same thing said twice. The same argument made complete, one half waiting, one half arrived. When you read of God's steadfast love in the Psalms, the Hebrew word is hesed, a loyalty that does not calculate its own cost. You are reading the same loyalty that sent his Son into the world. It is not a new emotion. It is the same faithfulness, finally expressed at its fullest. And there is this. The Old Testament is also honest about the silence. Psalm 88 is the darkest text in the entire collection. It is a prayer that ends with no resolution, no sunrise, no reassurance, no reminder that God is near. It ends in darkness, just darkness. And it is in the Bible, preserved. Copied by scribes for 3,000 years, considered scripture. Because the God who is faithful is also honest enough to include in his book the prayers of people who felt abandoned, and to let those prayers stand without a tidy answer, because that is what honesty looks like, and because every generation that has prayed into silence deserves to know that someone else has been exactly where they are. A God with a history is a God you can trust, not because the history is always comfortable, it is not, but because the pattern is unmistakable. He keeps his word. Slowly, sometimes, through things that look like silence or absence or irreversible loss, but he keeps it. The Old Testament is not the part of the faith you grew past. It is the ground you are standing on. Now, one more thing before we close, and I mean this directly. For anyone who has spent years in the faith and feels a quiet guilt about how little they know the first half of their Bible. The man in the chariot on the desert road, the official from Ethiopia, reading Isaiah, was not a young man beginning his spiritual journey. He was educated, powerful, clearly someone who took his faith seriously, and he did not understand what he was reading. Not because he was not smart enough, because the text is deep enough that no one finds the bottom of it alone. Philip did not ask him why he had not figured it out sooner. Philip just sat down beside him, opened the text at the place where the official was already reading, and began from there. That is the only place anyone has ever started, the place where they are. If you are 50 years old, and the Old Testament has mostly been a closed book, you are not behind. You are exactly where the Ethiopian official was, holding the text, asking the right question, ready. The only thing that changes now is that you begin. So let me leave you with this. The letter was not half a letter. It never was. It was always one letter. One long, unbroken argument about a God who keeps his word, written across 15 centuries, through dozens of authors, in poetry and history and law and prophecy. An argument that reaches its climax not at the end of the Old Testament and not at the beginning of the New Testament, but at a hill outside Jerusalem, where a man who had memorized every word of the Hebrew Scriptures died reciting one of its psalms because he knew, even there, that the psalm did not end in death. Read the first page. The second page will never be the same again. There is a passage in the Old Testament that has stayed with certain people through hard seasons, a verse that finally landed, or one that never quite made sense but kept drawing you back. I would love to know which one it is. Leave it in the comments. Because those moments when an old text suddenly opens, and something you thought you knew becomes something you have never seen before, are some of the most remarkable things people share in this space.